When Pastor John Gray walked into Bishop T.D. Jakes' church that Sunday morning, it wasn't just a surprise entrance. It was a moment that sent a tremor through the entire gospel world, a moment that felt heavy, electric, and divinely timed, because the instant he stepped through the doors of the Potter's house, the room shifted as if everyone watching sensed that something historic, something spiritual, something deeply personal was unfolding right in front of them. Heads turned, whispers swept across the sanctuary like a quiet storm, and before anyone could gather their thoughts, phones were raised, cameras flashed, and within minutes the entire internet was buzzing with clips, screenshots, and shocked reactions as people tried to wrap their minds around why, after years of silence, storms, and distance, Pastor John Gray had chosen this day, this church, and this moment to walk into the sanctuary of a man who had once been like a father to him. It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday at the Potter's house in Dallas. Praise heavy in the air, the choir echoing through the building, people worshiping freely. But destiny has a way of redirecting the room when something bigger than routine is meant to happen, and the second Gray crossed the threshold, worship became witness, and everyone present suddenly felt like they were watching more than a church service. They were watching a story years in the making. A reunion heavy with history, conflict, redemption, and unspoken emotion. For so long, John Gray had been one of the most talked about preachers in America, not just for his powerful sermons, humor, and raw emotional transparency, but also for the storms that followed his rise, the controversies, the criticism, the headlines, the pressure of being famous in a role that never promised immunity from pain. People loved him, judged him, mocked him, defended him, and misunderstood him all at once. Yet when he walked into Bishop Jakes' church that morning, he didn't look like a celebrity preacher trying to spark attention. He looked like a man searching desperately for a place where his soul could breathe again. Eyewitnesses swore the atmosphere thickened the moment he entered, as if the building itself recognized the weight he carried. Because while the choir kept singing, something unspoken lingered under the music. That mixture of shock, discomfort, curiosity, and compassion people feel when they realize they're watching someone walk through both pain and purpose at the same time. No one knew if this was planned, spontaneous, or spirit-led, but insiders later revealed that Bishop Jakes was aware he was coming. Still, even with that knowledge, nobody, absolutely nobody, expected the emotional eruption that followed. Gray took a seat near the front, close enough to be seen by the entire congregation, but humble enough to keep his focus fixed on the pulpit instead of the crowd. Some said he looked peaceful, others said he looked like a man one breath away from breaking down, as if the sanctuary pressed against old wounds he had been carrying for far too long. That moment held so much history, because years ago, Bishop Jakes wasn't just a mentor, he was a spiritual father, the man who took a young, rising John Gray under his wing, the man who prayed for him, guided him, believed in him when the world had not yet noticed his gift, and the man whose presence shaped Gray's ministry more than most people realized. So when Gray's life later spiraled into public storms, scandals, criticism, broken moments, the question everyone whispered was whether the bond between teacher and student had fractured beyond repair. But now, there he was, walking back into the very church that had once held him up, and nobody knew if he was returning in humility, repentance, or aching desperation for restoration. As the service continued, the church tried to move forward, but the atmosphere clung to Gray like a spotlight. Every time someone mentioned grace, redemption, healing, or forgiveness, eyes slid toward him, as if the congregation sensed that this was not just a visitor sitting quietly. This was a man stepping back into the presence of someone who once shaped him. Rumors circulated quickly. Some said he was there to apologize, others whispered that it was strategic, meant to rebuild his public image. But for those who watched closely, his body language told a different story entirely. This wasn't a publicity moment, this was a soul-deep moment. And then, finally, Bishop Jakes stepped up to the pulpit, and the crowd erupted. But the real moment wasn't the applause, it was the heavy, expectant silence that fell the second it faded. You could literally feel the sanctuary holding its breath, waiting to see if the bishop would acknowledge John Gray. Jakes began his sermon gently, his voice filled with the weight of wisdom, speaking about forgiveness, about storms, about broken men who rise again, about the courage it takes to return to a place connected to your past even when you're carrying wounds the world has mocked. Every sentence felt autobiographical. Every line felt like it was being delivered straight to Gray's heart, even though his name was never spoken, and people around the sanctuary whispered that they saw Gray lower his head, shoulders trembling, quietly wiping tears while trying to stay composed. With every word Jakes released, the room grew heavier, not with judgment, but with compassion, because suddenly this wasn't a sermon anymore. This was a father speaking to a son without saying his name, a mentor offering healing without calling attention to the wound, a moment of spiritual intimacy displayed in front of thousands. The sermon became a mirror, reflecting pain, restoration, humanity, and whether you loved John Gray or criticized him, whether you celebrated him or judged him, one thing became undeniable in that sanctuary: you were witnessing a man facing his past, his failures, his fears, and his faith in real time. Every word, every pause, every breath from Bishop Jakes felt like a divine message aimed directly at the man sitting only a few rows away. And though the bishop never identified him, everyone knew exactly what was happening. They were watching a moment of redemption unfold, a moment that felt like God himself was trying to piece a broken story back together in front of the world. Gray sat there with his head bowed and his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had turned white, as if he were trying to hold himself together, while every word flowing from Bishop Jakes's mouth cut straight through him, like a blade finding the softest part of the soul. And if you had been sitting in that sanctuary that morning, you would have felt it too. The kind of silence that doesn't simply settle in a room but sinks into the bones of every person present. The kind of stillness where even the subtle scrape of a chair leg across the floor feels loud enough to echo across the walls. People kept glancing at Bishop Jakes and then shifting their eyes back to John Gray, the tension rising like a slow-moving tide, and everyone seemed to share the same unspoken thought that something massive, something historic, was about to take place. And then, suddenly, destiny took a turn none of them saw coming. In the middle of his sermon, right when everyone expected him to continue building the momentum of his message, Bishop Jakes paused. Not a casual pause, but one of those heavy, soul-searching pauses that makes the whole room lean forward without realizing it. His voice softened, his tone shifted, and in a way that felt almost prophetic, he said, "Sometimes, the hardest thing for a man to do is to show up, especially after he's been through the fire." You could feel the air leave the room. Some people gasped quietly, others grabbed the arm of the person sitting next to them, and you could hear whispers spreading like ripples on water. "He's talking about John. He's talking about John." For a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped spinning and was holding its breath in that sanctuary. Then Bishop Jakes lifted his eyes and looked out into the congregation, scanning the room with a knowing expression. Everyone knew exactly who he was searching for. Slowly, almost reluctantly, John Gray lifted his head. His eyes were swollen and red. His face looked weighed down by years of battles and burdens. His expression softened into something painful but honest. And then, it happened, the moment that shook everyone to their core. Bishop Jakes extended his hand toward him and spoke two words that broke down every emotional wall in the building. "Come here, son." That single sentence shattered the room. You could hear people sobbing instantly. Phones flew out of pockets. Some people put their hands over their mouths. As John Gray stood, the entire church fell into a silence so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. He began walking toward the altar with slow, heavy steps, each footstep carrying years of pain, regret, hope, and fear. This was not the bold preacher who once commanded stages. This was a humbled man carrying the weight of his own story on his shoulders. When he reached the altar, he hesitated for a heartbeat, as if asking himself whether he deserved to be there at all. But Bishop Jakes didn't wait. He stepped forward, opened his arms, and wrapped him in a long, tight embrace that felt less like a greeting and more like a spiritual rescue. The crowd erupted, and I mean erupted, clapping, shouting, crying, calling out to God. That moment was raw, unfiltered, and overwhelming. You could feel the emotion even through a screen as the videos later spread online. And let me tell you something shocking. None of it was planned. Not one detail. There was no script, no announcement, no expectation. It was just two men, one broken, one forgiving, standing at the altar in front of thousands, wrapped in a moment of grace that was as unexpected as it was unforgettable. For that brief moment, all the scandals, all the headlines, all the judgment vanished. People swore they saw tears streaming from both men's eyes. Others said they heard Bishop Jakes whisper something into Gray's ear, though no one could say for certain what it was. Some who were close enough insisted they heard him whisper, "You're still called." And when those words hit the air, when the congregation sensed what had been spoken, the church erupted again. Applause, shouting, emotional release that filled the entire sanctuary like a wave crashing onto shore. But here's the twist. The part people rarely talk about. Not everyone celebrated. Some people sat frozen, unsure whether what they were witnessing was healing or premature forgiveness. Others looked conflicted, struggling to decide whether it was the perfect picture of grace or something that came too soon. But regardless of their opinions, one thing was certain: Everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed a moment that would be talked about for years. As the music began again, and the choir filled the sanctuary with praise, people kept recording, trying to capture what their hearts could barely process. Tears streamed down faces everywhere. Even people who didn't know John Gray personally felt the weight of what had just occurred. It wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about pastors. It was about forgiveness. It was about a man facing his mistakes and still standing. It was about being broken and choosing to walk forward anyway. But behind that public embrace, an even deeper story waited to unfold, one that the cameras didn't catch. Because after the service, when the crowd lingered and replayed the emotional moment with each other, John Gray quietly slipped away into a side corridor, accompanied only by a few staff members and close friends. The congregation didn't know where he went, but insiders would soon reveal that this was where the real heart of the story began. Bishop Jakes invited John Gray into his private office, far away from cameras, microphones, and the thousands of eyes watching from the sanctuary. For nearly an hour, the two men spoke alone. No audience, no noise, no social media, just truth. Insiders later described their meeting as deeply emotional, raw, and honest. Gray reportedly opened up about his regrets, his battles, his fears, and the weight he'd carried through years of controversy. He spoke about the nights he couldn't sleep, the mistakes that haunted him, and the fear that God and people had given up on him. Bishop Jakes listened as a father would, but he didn't offer soft, empty comfort. Those who heard about the meeting said his words were both firm and loving. He reminded Gray that redemption does not cancel responsibility, that public forgiveness does not erase the need for private discipline, that rebuilding trust requires time, humility, and consistency, not grand moments on stage. He told him that restoration is a journey, not an event. And here's the shocking part. Even though their meeting was private and sacred, the story did not stay hidden. Word began to leak through staff members, volunteers, and social media whispers. Clips from the service went viral. Hashtags like #JohnGrayReturns and #GraceInAction started trending. People began debating, was this a genuine spiritual moment or a strategic move to rebuild a tarnished public image? Some argued it was pure grace. Others insisted it was orchestrated. But regardless of the debates, one truth echoed louder than all the noise. What happened that day at the Potter's house was bigger than gossip, bigger than criticism, bigger than controversy. It was the kind of moment that forces people to look at themselves and ask the hardest questions about forgiveness, judgment, failure, restoration, and the human soul's longing to be seen not for its mistakes, but for its potential to rise again. Just when everyone thought they had seen everything, new footage began to surface online like waves of revelation crashing onto the shores of an already emotional story. Footage showing angles that no one had seen during the live stream, angles that captured John Gray breaking down in quiet, uncontrollable tears even before Bishop Jakes approached him, angles that showed security stepping in to gently move away a few overwhelmed attendees who were trying to get closer to the moment. All of it revealing just how intensely the room had been vibrating with emotion that morning. And the craziest part was how people immediately began questioning the timing of it all, wondering aloud whether the sermon, the embrace, and the private meeting afterward were coincidences of divine timing, or if something bigger, deeper, and far more intentional had been unfolding behind the scenes. Social media lit up like a wildfire, exploding with speculation and commentary, and even well-known Christian voices, pastors, commentators, influencers, jumped into the conversation, taking sides, dissecting every moment, replaying clips, offering interpretations, and debating whether this was a true moment of God-ordained restoration or simply a strategic act that looked spiritual on the surface. Let me tell you, this wasn't just a story about two men anymore. It had become a massive conversation about perception, about the complexity of forgiveness, about the challenge of redemption in the public eye, and about how a single moment, captured by 100 phones and millions of hearts, can ignite debates that stretch across continents within hours. People began to ask deep and uncomfortable questions. Was this accountability or was it emotional theater? Was it grace or was it premature restoration? Should a fallen leader be publicly embraced before time proves repentance? Or was this moment a glimpse of what real, raw, messy grace actually looks like? And all the while, John Gray's quiet demeanor, his trembling hands, his tears, his bowed head, his willingness to face his past in the very place his spiritual journey had once soared, made the entire situation feel painfully human and impossible to ignore. Even after the service ended and the private meeting concluded, the conversation didn't fade. Instead, it spread outward like ripples across a still lake. Some in the congregation called the moment historic, something they would tell their children about. Others whispered that it was controversial, that it had stirred old wounds instead of closing them. But everyone agreed on one thing: what had happened that day was powerful, emotional, and unforgettable. And just when the world thought the dust was settling, the story took another unexpected turn, because days later, even more surprising details surfaced, details that added a new and electrifying layer to an already intense moment. New reports suggested that influential figures within the Christian community had quietly encouraged the meeting, hoping to guide Gray toward a fresh chapter and a healthier direction, while others insisted that the encounter had been purely spiritual, an unplanned act of grace that unfolded in divine timing rather than human design. These conflicting narratives only intensified the conversation, making the story even bigger than before. Social media was flooded with debates. Some users praised what happened as a breathtaking act of love and mercy, while others criticized as a calculated attempt to shift public perception. But the truth, the real truth, was much more complicated than either side wanted to admit. And then came the new footage, the new photos, the new angles that hadn't been part of the original stream. People zoomed in, analyzed facial expressions, dissected every tear, every pause, every moment of hesitation. Gray's vulnerability, the shaking in his hands, the deep breath he took before stepping forward, all became part of the public's examination. Comments poured in from around the world. Was this real? Some asked. Was it orchestrated? Others demanded. And here's the craziest part: no matter which side people fell on, the debate itself became part of the story, proof of how deeply people care about forgiveness, redemption, authenticity, and accountability in spiritual leadership. Meanwhile, John Gray quietly retreated from the spotlight, choosing silence instead of statements, reflection instead of reaction. For the first time in years, he slowed down on social media. Sources close to him revealed that he had taken Bishop Jakes' advice to heart, focusing not on attention or applause but on rebuilding his integrity, credibility, and ministry from the inside out, far away from cameras and comments. It was as if the embrace, the sermon, and the private conversation had cracked something open inside him, a turning point not just in publicity, but in his own inner journey. And while the world debated authenticity, those who had been in the sanctuary that day described something deeper, something harder to explain. A sense of peace settling over the room, like a warm blanket, a rush of release that felt like years of tension, judgment, and disappointment finally exhaling into the atmosphere. Many said they had never felt anything like it in a church before, a moment where grace didn't feel polished or pretty, but wild, raw, tear-stained, and deeply human. And that, perhaps, was what made it unforgettable. As the dust settled and the story entered public memory, it left behind questions that still linger in the hearts of believers everywhere. Can fallen leaders truly be restored in the eyes of the world? How do grace and accountability coexist when the entire journey is being watched by millions? What does forgiveness look like when the wound is public and the healing must be too? And for John Gray, that single visit to the Potter's house was more than a return. It was a moment that reshaped his narrative, his ministry, and maybe even his life. Destiny took an unexpected turn that Sunday, and in the end, what the world witnessed wasn't just controversy, it was humanity on display, forgiveness unfolding in real time, and the messy, powerful, unforgettable way grace can step into a moment and change everything. Some will call it redemption, some will call it strategy, but no one, absolutely no one, who saw it will ever forget the weight of that day or how a single moment shifted the story of two men, a congregation, and an entire conversation about faith, mistakes, and second chances.